Hey everybody, we'll get started here. I did want to go through a few announcements. First of all, the Oklahoma Well Log Library is looking for volunteers to help scan part of their collection. And I put the flyer out there, but just give them a call or stop by and ask about it. They could even like an hour or two at a time to be a big help. And if you're interested in that, please contact them. And then just to remind everyone, in 2 weeks, we'll have a webinar on renewable energy with subsurface storage and next generation geothermal with Mike Euros. In April, again, just a reminder, we'll have a luncheon April 11th, exploration and extraction of iodized produced water in the Anadarko Basin with Andrew Gordon and David Edlin. And then April 24th, also just a reminder, is the awards banquet. They'll give their awards to teachers and students and to be the keynote speaker. And then stay tuned. We do want to have a happy hour in April, but I don't have a date on that yet. Get started. There is still food out there, and I left the back door open, so feel free to get seconds. There's just their drinks in the back. I want to introduce Ashley Shaw and Jon McKenna from MicroSeismic. They came up here today to talk to us. John's going to be our speaker today. He's an engineer, and with MicroSeismic, he has his bachelor's and master's degree from Colorado School. I'll let you talk the rest. Okay, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. I think this microphone's dead, actually, but it's not coming on, but it doesn't matter. I can speak loud. Hopefully people can hear online. I'll stand a little bit close to my computer, but thank you for having me today. The title of my talk is Optimizing Estimated Ultimate Reserves, or EUR, through Advanced Microseismic Monitoring Techniques. And we're also going to demonstrate a return of investment, or ROI, on the monitoring costs. And if you see at the top, we have a number where I'm from MicroSeismic Inc., but we have a number of other different brands for monitoring hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas operations. And then we're also involved in CO2 sequestration, our CO2 secure offering, and then Ashley's heading up our karst alert for monitoring signals. And then also we're involved in geophysical energy. So I've got about 5 examples of how we can demonstrate return of investment, and they're broken up into 3 main categories. The first 3 are dealing with current problems like figuring out ideal wellbore spacing, and then parent well refract. So if you have a parent well that is underperforming, either due to maybe substandard or superior treatment design, or it's just doesn't seem to be working or producing like you're expecting, you can go in and refract a parent well. We've got a really nice example of how to refract, initially repressurize the parent well and then refract it. And then once you've repressured it, you can take advantage of that increased pressure and treat your offset child wells. And then an example on doing it right from now on. So these are some things that you can take advantage with treatment order, where instead of drilling a well and then having to come back later and drill and treat an offset child well, you just kind of try to do it all right first time. And then the final one is going to be on geohazards. And I've got listed what I'm going to be talking about. If you look at the second bullet point on each one, the return of investment, it's right around 1 to 2 months where you recover your monitoring costs that you put up front for monitoring microseismic activity. And then we're demonstrating that you get return of investment after about that 1 to 2 month period. And with avoiding geohazards, we don't have an EUR measurement on that, but you get your return of investment just by saving one well from casing. So we are monitoring from the surface at MicroSeismic Inc. We've done downhole, but we believe that surface monitoring returns the best results. And we have two primary examples how we monitor a surface frac star, which is laid right out at the surface. This is considered a temporary array that can be laid out rapidly and collected quickly. And then we have a near surface buried array. We have more geophones laid directly at the surface of the frac star because we have to deal with surface noise, and then less geophones using the buried array because we drill them in about 300 feet deep, put the geophones in about 300 feet deep and cement them into the surface. And so we don't have to deal with the cultural noise at the surface. But these arrays are designed to perform about the same. The buried array is considered a permanent array, and you can use it to monitor the entire field. And when you monitor from the surface, it's nice. It's a nice way to monitor because you can monitor your stimulation from toe to heel, as well as different stacked pay and different wells located all around the array or underneath the array, and you get the same uncertainty on your event locations. It's different than if you're drilling and monitoring. You're monitoring downhole, where your uncertainty of your event locations increases as you get further away from that monitor. Also, when you're monitoring from the surface, we can sample the entire P-wave radiation pattern of the event as it propagates up to the surface. And when we do that, we can invert for the source mechanism or these focal mechanisms and run auto MTI, which is automatic moment-tensive reversion for each event. And this tells us how that rock is breaking. So as that rock breaks, for example, if it's a dip slip failure, and it's slipping in the direction of the dip, that movement or P-wave radiation pattern is propagated up to the surface, and we determine the strike and dip of that fracture plane, as well as the orientation that it's failing. And so an example of what that looks like is shown here with the different colors. So blue is showing a negative polarity, so where you get a negative first arrival, where the hanging wall is moving down with respect to the footwall, whereas the red side of the array is showing apparent first motion up. And then you see the different sizes of the P-wave radiation pattern, where it's largest in the center of the focal sphere, indicating we really stand at the focal sphere. And then we can invert for that focal mechanism, showing it as a beach ball, telling us that for this one, we have a dip slip failure with a 78-degree strike and 88-degree dip. Now, what's interesting is if we see these focal mechanisms changing during the treatment. So, for example, if you drill and you treat a well, you increase the pressure there. In normal stress regime, they're going to rock is going to initially fail as a dip slip. Whereas if you then treat an offset well, if your fractures go back over the area that was previously treated, that area is already pressured up, and the stresses are actually changing in that area. And we'll see that the focal mechanisms will change to strike slip, indicating that there's actually a rotation stress, and we can determine where that area is already stressed up. And when you have these altered stress changes. So if you look, the strike, if I go back, initially the strike was 78 degrees with steeply dipping plane, whereas when it's changed to strike slip, it's still the same plane that's failing. It's just that instead of it slipping in the direction of the dip, it's now slipping in the direction of the strike. And so I'll be talking about how we see these changes and what they mean. So we can take those focal mechanisms and use the information from that full moment tensor inversion to create a discrete fracture network model. And so the fractures themselves are oriented by the strike and dip of the focal mechanism. They're centered on the hypocenter. And then we can back out the area of the slip plane because we also measure the seismic moment and the displacement along the slip plane. So that gives us the orientation of all the fractures as well as their size and location. And then we initially make an estimate on the aperture, which is the amount that it's opening based on the length of the fracture. This is taken from empirical data from outcrop, that there's a correlation with the longer the fracture, the greater the fracture will open. And then we further refine that aperture using more information from the full moment tensor that tells us actually how much that fracture is opening. And it generally follows this sinusoidal wave as a function of the rake. So you're going from strike slip into normal dip slip mechanisms. And what we see is that these normal dip slip mechanisms tends to have the greatest amount of aperture. So suggesting that when the rock is failing under the virgin reservoir stress, when it's failing as these dip slip, you actually get more fracture volume, or it's opening greater than if it's slipping as a strike slip in this altered stress state. It tends to just be slipping in the direction of the strike and not actually opening nearly as much. And then I'll just back up real quick. This fracture network, we then want to calibrate our entire discrete fracture network volume to your actual injected treatment volume. And the reason that we do that is because we don't detect every single microseismic event. Some are below our detection threshold. And so to account for that missing population, we calibrate our fracture network using a mass balance technique. So we set the volume of our fractures equal to the total injected slurry volume minus what's leaking off of the formation. And that allows our fractures to grow in the direction of strike and dip a bit, allowing for us to have. That way it's actually makes sense with your injected volumes and with reality. And then we can inject proppant into this CFN to you take the amount of proppant that's injected on a stage-by-stage basis, and it you can inject it into the fracture model to get an idea of the. And the way that we do that is using this modeling technique, where for every stage that we are monitoring, we're tracking where that fracture volume is moving. So if initially one stage you're creating a lot of fracture volume off to the east, then we're injecting that proppant that's also preferentially building out to the east, where then you change the stress and your next stage is moving off to the west. Our proppant model will fill out the fractures off to the west. So in this way, it's a fully dynamic model based on actual measurements within the reservoir. And so now I'll get into the examples. This is an example where they decrease the wellbore spacing. We see that this is targeting the Eagleford. The wells are located in the Eagleford, but a lot of energy also going up into the shallower Austin Chalk. This is a cross-sectional view looking from heel to toe. And in this example, they had 3 wells, well 1H, 2H, and 3H. The 1H was treated first, and they treated stage 1 of the 1H, followed by stage 1 of the 2H, and then stage 1 of the 3H. But we're monitoring in real time and realized that the wells were not drilled the same length. And so when you treated well 1H first, it wasn't in line with the treatment of in terms of propagation and pressure and propagation from the 1H to the 2 to the 3. So they sped up the treatment. So then they were treating consecutively located stages in order. So that was one of the benefits they got from monitoring in real time. And what you can see is that before the wells were aligned with SH Max, you see some disorganization of the microseismic events, a little bit longer half length, but then once they were all in line, now you're taking advantage of the pressures and pressure shadows from each individual well, and we see that the fractures are actually more concentrated right around the wellbore, so you end up with more concentrated fractures and rubblizing right around the fractures, right around the stage being treated. And then when we look at the fractures, the total fracture volume being created around the wells, we get about a half length of about 250 feet, indicating that at the current wellbore spacing, that these wells were drilled a bit too far apart and they could be brought together. And also when we look at when we look at the model prop fracture volume, that indeed even greater gap between the prop fracture volume between the wells. And so you could basically add another wellbore per section and still not have any overlap of the total fracture volume between the wells. So you really don't have any communication by adding another wellbore per section. And so you don't have any real big loss of production. So there's a bump of production of about 30%. And the average cost of this survey was $215,000 per well, which was recovered after 9.3 thousand barrels of oil equivalent produced at $70 per barrel, or after 2 months of production, you recovered your monitoring costs. And actually, if I back up, you can also see as you go from toe to heel that the fractures are getting larger as you go from the toe. So in general, an observation that we see from project to project is you don't get as much microseismicity at the toe because it takes a while to pressure up that formation. And then you're transferring energy from toe, from stage to stage, as well as from well to well, so that by the time you're down at the heel, you're getting the largest amount of pressure. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about frac hits. Frac hits are common in unconventional horizontal development, and the production from the parent well creates a zone of lower pressure or a pressure sink, and also results in changes in geomechanical properties due to that depletion. And then if you drill a second well, a child well later on after you've depleted from the reservoir, the treatment from the child well can preferentially grow back towards that lower pressure or that pressure sink. And that preferential growth can create a compromised stimulated rock volume, or SRV, of the child well, and also affect the production of the parent. And here's an example of the monitoring results when we have a vertical parent well. So this is map view. We're looking down at the vertical parent well, and then we've got two horizontal child wells drilled off to the east. So initially, when you're treating child well A, we see that this stage is not affected by the nearby parent well, and there's good symmetry of the events propagating subparallel to SH max, which in this case is about 80-degree azimuth. And there's some interactions with child well B. And then as you get closer to the vertical parent well, we see that you have more asymmetry of the microseismicity growing back towards that parent well. And you can start to understand how far out the depleted state would be around that parent well. And at the same time, we're also seeing a slight increase in the pressure in that parent. And then as your stage becomes more aligned with SH max in the direction of that parent well, we see that this stage has hit the vertical parent well, and there's also a large increase in pressure observed in that parent. And then one subsequent stages, even though they're not as even aligned as well with SH max with the parent well, we still see a lot of energy going right back into that parent well. And the activity is not just restricted to the targeted interval of that child well. In this case, we saw a rare example where the fluid entered the parent well at the ports located in the target zone. And then when the pressure in the parent well eventually exceeded the refracturing pressure of the deepest target, we saw even more microseismicity occurring down at depth. And there's different types of frac hits. We have poroelastic pressure hits. So I talked about dip slip events where when they slip, they also tend to dilate greater than the strike slip events. And when they dilate, you can have, you're creating more volume. So the pressure increases in the formation to cause dilation. And then because of the increased volume, you have a slight decrease in pressure. And then you have to build up that pressure to cause subsequent fracture. Whereas when you have strike slip, you're getting less dilation, so it takes less energy to continue to reactivate and strike slip. And whenever you have these changes in volume, you can also be transferring stress to different fractures. And so in strike slip, like reactivating faults, you can transfer that stress further along the fault, causing it to kind of have runway activity. Then when you treat a well and increase the pressure there, and then treat an offset well within a time where that pressure does not have time to dissipate, when your pressure wave comes over and interacts with that area that's already pressured up, you can cause a transfer of that pressure without actually sending fluid all the way over to the tip of the fracture. And so we could have some pressure communication. It's like a brake pedal effect. When you step on the brakes, brake pedal, you get a immediate response to brakes, but you're not actually sending fluid all the way to the brake pedal. Whereas if you treat a well and create that pressured up area, and then you wait too long to treat your offset well, that pressure will dissipate. And then when you inject in your offset well, you can actually send your actual fluid back over to that other well. And so we call that fluid invasion. And then in more extreme cases, full proppant invasion. And the results of these frac hits are temporary loss of production, permanent loss of production, poor SRD, RV development in the child well, and then even wellbore damage or complete loss of the well. And so what are some frac hit mitigation strategies? I've got them all listed here, and they go from red to orange to green, indicating the red is really not very effective, the orange is somewhat effective, and green is the most effective. So I'll kind of run through them. The strategies that aren't very effective are just shutting in the nearby parent well, or abandoning nearby parent wells, or keeping the parent well flowing during the child frac. And then some examples that are somewhat effective are small preloads of the parent well. So you're trying to pressure up that parent well, but not doing it in a way that is effectively repressurizing the entire lateral. And then a bullhead refrac of the parent well. This is if you have an open hole parent well and you're just going in and trying to just re-stimulate it without doing any isolation or pre-pressurization of the parent well. And then things that are effective are large preloads of the parent well. So low pressure, long duration, low rate to try to repressurize that entire lateral, so that if you treat an offset child well, you're taking advantage of that repressurized parent well, so you're not sending a lot of your energy from your offset child well back to your parent well. And then, like I said, the co-development of wells, zipper fracs and tank development are the most effective ways to reduce frac hits. These are where you're treating entire pads and then going to another pad and kind of propagating that pressure wave through the system and creating a scenario where you're going to keep some wells pressured up to prevent new treated wells from going all the way over and having frac hits on your producing wells. So we'll run through some of these examples. So an example of a bullhead refrac of the parent well that's somewhat effective. These are the results that we see. So like I said, maybe you have a parent well that's underperforming to the local type curve, and you deem that you want to refrac that parent well to bump up production. Well, in the past, some clients have gone in and just injected without any isolation or trying to repressurize the parent well, just going in and doing a bullhead refrac, trying to stimulate the entire well. We see that the microseismicity is really just located at the heel of the well or the heelward third of the well. And typically they're injecting these large volumes, also using diverter to try to divert the frac from going from the heel all the way down to the toe. But as we see in this example where they have a long open hole section of the toe, they did this as an experiment to try to see how effective it was to inject a number of different stages into this open hole section, and while injecting diverter. That in this example, the diverter alone did not solve the problem, and all the microseismicity was still located at this heel section of this section. And so why are we seeing that? Well, the short answer is it's due to the pressure drop along the lateral. So what we see is it doesn't matter what formation is being injected. We always see microseismicity located at the heel of the well. And when we look at going from heel to toe, as you inject your fluid, here's showing after after 0 minutes or virgin reservoir pressure conditions. When you start injecting after 5, then 10 and 20 minutes, you're increasing the pressure along the lateral, but there's a large pressure drop going from heel to toe. So and that's due to frictional losses along the lateral. And so you have the greatest amount of pressure at the heel. And so in a bullhead refrac, create large pressures at the heel. And that's where once those pressures exceed fracture gradient, you start to get fractures, and then you just blow out the heel and keep dumping more and more fluid into the heel, causing more activity at the heel. And we look at the amount of injected fluid as a function of microseismicity. We see that a lot of the microseismicity doesn't occur until a significant amount of volume is actually injected. As much as even 40% of your volume needs to be injected before you even see any activity, indicating that you're really just repressurizing these depleted fractures before we see any activity. And we look at the ISIPs along the lateral as they're injecting. The initial ISIPs are below your original ISIP or your original fracture gradient. And so in a depleted sense, it takes a number of stages to increase the pressure in the formation until you exceed the original ISIP or the fracture gradient. And once you've done that, then you start to get microseismicity, start to break new rock. So what are some effective strategies for mitigating frac hits? One is a large preload of the parent well. And so instead of just jumping to your stimulation step, we've done we've done some modeling that suggests adding a step 1 pressurization step will be better at effectively refilling all these depleted fractures from heel to toe. So what you do is a low rate, long duration pressurization step, keeping your pressure below your fracture closure pressure, which encourages repressurizing from the heel all the way down to the toe. And then once you've done that, you then go in with a high pressure stimulation step to initiate shear failure on critically stressed fractures. And this is best performed using real-time microseismic monitoring, because when we're monitoring during this initial pressurization step, we really don't want to see any microseismicity. And then we want to see microseismicity occurring all the way down to during the stimulation step. And so here's an example taken from Equinor, where they refract these two parent wells showing in orange and red. And then they followed their stimulation by these purple wells on their immediate offset child wells, and then finally treated their further offset child wells. And the refract design of the parent wells, they refract their parent wells first, followed by a low rate prefill, and then their bullhead stimulation of 1.5 million pounds of sand and 70,000 barrels of fluid injected with diverter, followed by their child wells, treating their immediate child wells first, followed by their further offset child wells. And this was done treating the Three Forks and Bakken and Williston Basin. And so here's their treatment design, showing that their initial prefill occurred for as much as 3.5 days. And they were keeping the pressure below the shaded fracture gradient. So they're keeping their pressure below the pressure required to create new fractures. And then they demonstrated that they managed to repressurize the well at 95% of the initial ISIP within the target volume and rate. And that low rate prefill improves subsequent refract lateral coverage. And then they brought the pressure and rate up to then refract that. And so, like I said, during the pre-fill, we didn't see any microseismicity along the parent well. But during their actual stimulation step, we see microseismicity occurring all the way down to the toe on both well A and B. Now, there is some increase in microseismicity as at the heel, where those pressures still are the largest. And so when we look at EUR over time, cumulative oil produced over time, this is the production of the parent well. And then at this point, that's when they refract the parent well, and we see an increase in the production. So we can carry out the actual model out the cumulative oil production over 200 months to demonstrate that we've increased the EUR by about 50% on parent well A and by about 28% after well B. So on average, we show parent well shows increased EUR uplift of about 35%. And the average cost of the survey is $215,000 per well, which was recovered after 3,000 barrels of oil equivalent produced at $70 oil, or after 1 to 2 months of production. And that preload will save your immediate offset child well as well. So this shows the microseismicity difference between when you have not re-stimulated your parent well. So this is the parent well, and then this is the new well treated. We see a lot of microseismicity going back to the parent well when that child well is completed, versus here is the parent well that was repressurized and refract, and then the microseismicity is occurring during the treatment of this offset child well. And we see initially there was severe asymmetry of the child well towards the parent well, whereas the refract really lessened that asymmetry towards the depleted well. And the refract contributed to better fracture placement and therefore better production of the child wells. Consequently, in the heel, we also were measuring downhole microseismicity, which showed the same result. And so what is that bump? What does that bump in production look like? We're showing two figures. This first one is child well production without the parent well refrac, and then this is with the parent well refrac, and then this is without the parent well restimulation. Both graphs show this black curve, which is your regional type curve. And then without a parent well restimulation, the immediate child wells tend to underperform as compared to the regional type curves. However, once you've done that, the parent well restimulation and refrac, that now the red immediate child wells are performing at or even above regional type curve. And we're also seeing that some of these new wells away from the parent tend to also underperform, whereas on average, most of them are even overperforming. So tends to be production loss of these immediate child wells greater than 25% when they're treated right next to a parent well. And so on average, we're increasing that production by about 25%. So the average cost of the survey was $300,000 per well, which is recovered after 4.25 thousand barrels of oil produced at $70 per barrel, or after 1 to 2 months of production. And then finally, our last example is co-development of wells. So we're talking zipper fracs, tri-zippers, and tank development. And so in general, if you have 2 wells and you're just treating well 1 from toe to heel, like I said, due to compounding core pressures from stage to stage, we tend to see larger fractures and more energy created as you go from toe to heel. And then if, say, you have some preferential growth of well 1 towards well 2, when you treat well 2, you'll even have more growth away from that initial pressurization of well 1. And in the areas where you have overlapping fractures, that's where you get compounding core pressures from well to well. And in that location, stresses tend to rotate, and you're getting a change from these normal dip slip mechanisms to strike slip, which can actually illuminate the areas that are already initially pressured up and showing stress shadow effects. So we look at increased fracture volume. You see an increased fracture volume just from well 1 going from toe to heel, and then even increased fracture volume as you go from well 1 to well 2. So you're compounding core pressures from toe to heel as well as from well to well. And when you have your well 1 is your leading well, so going from top to bottom, followed by your well 2 as your trailing well, you tend to see a rotation in SH max. So it shows that SH max is initially kind of east-west, but when you treat well 1 followed by well 2, you'd see an apparent rotation, a left lateral rotation between the 2 stimulations, which is actually what we see. Versus if you treat well 2 before well 1, then you would see an apparent left lateral or right lateral rotation between the 2. And so if you have a fault that may actually be preferentially aligned with that rotation and stress, it could cause make those faults even more susceptible to failure just based on the treatment. And then when we look at the changes in the rake, so we see that areas where you have overlapping fractures, you actually also have a change in the rake of your focal mechanisms, where they're changing from your cool colors of your virgin reservoir stress state to an altered stress state shown as when you're getting these more strike slip events. And so another thing that we like to do is to reference all our microseismic events to their stage center. And it's as if we reference all microseismic events to their stage center, or stack all the stages on top of one another. And then we can then create a heat map of all that microseismicity to try to show what a single representative stage would look like. And the reason we might do this is if all the stages are completed the same, then we can get an example of what a typical stage might look like. And so that's what I've done for these three examples, except for instead of showing a heat map with fracture volume, I'm showing the heat map with the dominant rakes that are observed. And so what we see is that the rakes are initially occurring when you treat with no other well treated in the area. This first example is an isolated well with no other wells treated in the area. You're causing failure to occur primarily as these cool colors or virgin reservoir stress state, versus if you treat a well, if you treat an offset well, two offset wells is like a triple zipper, treat these offset wells and then treat the center well, we see that on either side of the area that has already been pressured up, the focal mechanisms are changing from cool colors to red, and that red is indicating areas where the stress shadow is persisting. Consequently enough, we see that the stress state SH max, originally located at or oriented with about an 80-degree orientation, has an apparent left lateral rotation on the left side of the wellbore and apparent right lateral rotation on the right side of the wellbore. So this stress shadow impact on neighboring wells is time dependent on the stage lag time. So like I said, if you treat a well and then that area is pressured up, you go and treat an offset well, there is a stress shadow around that well that initially was treated. And after some time, that stress shadow effect will go away. And now if you treat an offset well, you can lose a lot of fluid going back to your previously treated wells. And so we can see that time-dependent stress shadow effect, and it is a function of the stage lag time. So this final example, is a cross-sectional view. They treat the shallow well, and then after 18 days, they treat a deeper well. So originally there was a stress shadow effect around that shallow well, but now after 18 days, that stress shadow has gone back to its original reservoir stress state. And now the majority of your fluid and proppant is going back to your previously treated well. And so you can take advantage of this treatment order. I've demonstrated that core pressure compounds from stage to stage, from toe to heel, as well as from well to well. And it can also persist as you go from pad to pad. So this is a technique that QEP came up with called tank development. And what they're doing is treating a whole pad of wells. So this shows pads 1 through 5, where these are your producing wells, and then your neighboring pad are completed wells that are awaiting pressure. So they've been completed, but they're not being produced. So they're retaining that pressure wall. Then pad 3 are wells undergoing completion so that they're actually injecting and stimulating. Then a buffer zone where no wells are being drilled or completed. And then finally 5, where these are wells being drilled. So the idea is that the wells that are being completed have a pressure wall in between the completed wells and the wells that are on production to minimize any frac hit going all the way over producing wells. And this pressure wall, ideally you treat your western wells first, followed by your eastern wells last, so that's where you have the highest pressure, so that when you go in and treat and complete your easternmost wells, you've had the most pressure on that eastern side to prevent any frac hits going all the way over to your producing wells. And they've demonstrated that they get a bump in their EUR for their non-tank development, their non-tank EUR versus their tank EUR. When they take advantage of these pressure walls, they get better production than if they don't, and it increases these curves diverge the most as you have higher density of wells per mile. So you have more wells drilled per drilling spacing unit. And they show that this bump in EUR could be about 10% with lower density and as much as 50 or 60% with higher density wells per mile. And on average, an increase in EUR by 35%. And so the average cost of the survey is $200,000 per well, which is recovered after 2.8 thousand barrels of oil equivalent produced at $70 oil or after 1.5 months of production. And then my final example is real-time monitoring with a geohazard. And so we're looking at a cross-sectional view with different color events. The red events are your typical fracture or hydraulic fracturing events. And then the blue is the specific focal mechanism that's associated with geohazard. And we see that this faulting is predominantly in the lower Eagle Ford and then progresses wellbore depth. And if it hits your wellbore, you cause deformation as well, since it's actually moving in strike slip. And that's the direction of the major deformation and can cause deformation of the well. And then when we look at how that activity looks in map view, you see a number of different wells drilled and stimulated. And in this case, the blue events are your main hydraulic fracturing events, your 40-degree dip slip events, and then the red are showing these strike slip events that could cause wellbore deformation. And what they did was they could see these strike slip events occurring in real time, and they could change their stimulation so that they are permit rapid adjustment to their treatment design that include lowering the rate, increasing viscosity, or introducing far field diverter, and or defining no perf zones. And so also a lot of these faults can be found in their 3D seismic, but they don't seem to be aligning with these faults that are actually occurring. So the 3D seismic alone is not as effective as real-time monitoring. And when they skip stages identified as susceptible to wellbore casing deformation, it de-risks as much as $2.3 million per well. And the way that we arrived at that is if they skip stages or areas where they're causing wellbore deformation more at the toe of the well, they've de-risked about 1/3 of the entire lateral. Or if they skip stages where faulting is occurring in the middle of the well, it's de-risking about 50% of the well. Or if they skip stages in the heel of the well, they de-risk pretty much about 90% of that lateral, which is about $2.3 million per well de-risked. And the monitoring costs are recovered just by saving one well. So we've shown 5 different examples, and on average, we showed that return of investment has been recovered after about 1 to 2 months of production, and that by avoiding a geohazard, the return of investment can be achieved by saving just one well from casing damage. So that's what I have for you guys. Hope you guys enjoyed the presentation, and it was thought-provoking for you to kind of think about how these wells can be treated to take advantage of these stretch elements. So thanks for your attention. Do you have any questions, comments?
46, if you go back to 46, are all of those, are all of the fractures, the blues, are they actually perpendicular to the wellbore? They're like they're showing, I mean, that's all for MicroSeismic. That's not.
Yeah, so they're progressing at a 40-degree strike. So they're not for the most part perpendicular. And then the strike slips are oriented at a 72 degree strike. So we can color the mechanisms by these specific faults, and you can display them in real time. So you can see these red faults occurring in real time, and you can see where they're occurring and make modifications to the treatment right. And this has become something that some of our clients require in their area because it's been so effective. And this is something that is occurring in Eagleford, Austin Chalk. And then we're also seeing similar thing occurring in Argentina, where you get this faulting that could result in wellbore deformation. Like I said, if it occurs in the heel, you could lose your entire well. And as you increase your pore pressures from toe to heel, it's even more likely that that would be the case. You get these off-azimuth strike slip events, like they occur when you have the highest pore pressures.
But just a comment finding and describing the orientation and motion on faults with microseismic actually gives me less confidence in 3D seismic.
Yeah, so in this case, these faults were kind of below the resolution. So they just are not, they don't seem to be correlated with that 3D seismic.
One example, I don't know which slide it was, but where your brackets, when you have one, you can see the fault in there, but it's offset considerably from where you're.
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
Got a question online too, asking about the applied to marginal wells. They're the Twisted Red part with Osage County.
So refracting.
Yeah, there's a way to bring back.
Yeah, that's a good question. And there is. So when you repressure and then re-stimulate, you can likely increase your treatment design. That's, you know, a more up-to-date treatment design. So that would most likely, you know, require that the parent well was initially treated with kind of substandard treatment design. So when you go in and repressurize it, use higher volumes, higher rate than the initial treatment, and you get additional fracturing. And it can improve marginal well production.
Please, I've got a question. See falls seismic.
Mm-hmm.
Time you see them, isn't it too late? Is your
Well, a lot of times they're, yeah, and it can be, but a lot of times these faults occur, like if you're lateral, it's here that the faulting is occurring out, like further laterally away from the wellbore, and then and you may see this approaching the wellbore, or because of how the SH max is oriented, hits the fault, and that fault may be progressing ahead of the treatment. And then you can see where it crosses the lateral, so that when you go to that area, you can then skip those stages where the fault is crossed. Yeah, I mean, it's not foolproof, and it can be too late. But with the two main clients that we've been working with, they have not had significant deformation, but lost their laterals while they were. Yeah.
So you're really watching.
you have to get a number of events before you can see. Oh,
Yeah, that's true.
You're seeing the faults on 3D seismic, but how long ago did those faults form? There may have been, when those faults formed, 5 million years in the past, there may have been a different stress field, and that's why they're not showing up with the same orientation.
Yeah.
I mean, you see that all the time, like continent. See, thrust faults, and it's all in.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think it's just more likely a matter of timing when those faults you see in the 3D side.
It's a good point.
Yeah, you're still going to see them, and later.
Yeah.
not necessarily the same stress field.
That's true. And then to add to your comment, also, if you get some faulting, say these wells that are on this eastern side were treated first, you can almost draw where those faults would cross later treated wells. So you know when to skip those offset wells, what stages to skip. But that's a good point. The modern day stress field needs to be understood with respect to the orientation of the faulting to understand which faults are more critically stressed. So,
What about in the case of a water flood?
yeah, so we see that Ashley and I were talking before this. In some areas, there are grabens above the treatment wells that when you reactivate these normal faulting grabens, you also cause water as well as sulfuric acid or gases to be produced at your well. So if it's the same sort of thing, if you're fracking out maybe up in Ellenberg or whatnot, any formation of water bearing, you can see the growth approaching these shallower formations, and you may want to shut down in real time before you actually tap into this water.
What's your kind of best practices for preserving the pressure when you've got a lot of offset vertical wells? Is it still the same slope repressurization?
Yeah, it's the same thing. It can be a little bit challenging in a vertical well because you have kind of higher pore pressures at depth. But the same sort of thing, you're trying to repressurize kind of the shallowest part of the formation and building it down to the deeper portion of the formation. But doing these low pressure, low rate, and keeping your pressure below your fracture rate. So you can bring the pressure up above the surrounding pore pressure. You just don't want to bring it up so much that you start to get the rock break.
Volume on repressuring, it looked like it was significantly smaller than the produced volume, such as that. Is it any standard ratio or?
That's a good question, and I'm not really sure. I think the amount of volume was just the amount that they could inject before their pressure was approaching the frac rate. So they may have gone longer and more volume. It's just that the pressure was getting fairly high, so that then they just kind of stopped after 3.5 days. But it can be a significant volume. And that's about what it is, about the amount of volume that you've recovered in depleting the reservoir. That's about how much you have to place here. Yeah, probably approximately 1-to-1.
Any more questions?
Yeah, thank you.
John, we do have a little gift for you.
Oh, that's nice.
Should we wrap up too much this time? Just a little ammonite to say thank you for listening to us.
It says, with gratitude, Tulsa Geological Survey, 2025, and it says beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming. And if you want to get in touch with us, my name is Jon McKenna. Here's my email and my phone number, as well as Ashley Shaw, her email and phone number. She's right here. She's the local frac monitoring